Furthermore, there will be some time at the end for some Q&A, so if you don't mind, kindly keep your microphone on mute during the presentation. With so many of us still working from home, it's inevitable that someone might be breaking out the old leaf blower here as we transition to fall, and so we want to make sure we want to do it. If you do have a question mid-presentation, feel free to use the chat functionality or the raise your hand icon, and I'll make sure to do my best to weave that question into the presentation. And speaking of the chat, I wanted to make sure to keep your eye on it, as during the presentation I'll be posting various updates. There'll be some important links during that. Also, I'm a big fan of the poll questions, so you might see a poll question on there. So with all of that out of the way, let's get down to some business here. So many of you are members of the Defense Industrial Base, and as you begin to prepare for your CMMC accreditation, you may have a lot of questions to ensure that your team is ready for certification, and we here at KAMIND are here to help you navigate that journey. One of the biggest concerns that our customers have told us over time is, hey guys, what are we missing? And in all honesty, this is the question. There we go. This is one question that Matt and I love to hear, because that means the customer speaking with is very aware that their cyber hygiene might be lacking or there might be missing something. But if you're attending this webinar and you're thinking, we've got it in the bag, we're in good shape, candidly, Matt and I are going to be very nervous. So KAMIND wants you to make sure to be aware what you might be missing. And as my good friends over across the pond say, as they board the tube at SW6, we need to make sure you are minding the gap. So during our time today, we're going to discuss kind of how and why CMMC is raising the cyber hygiene standards, how to use Microsoft and the Microsoft CMMC Placemat to help determine some of those gaps, trying to identify some of the gaps in your cyber security maturity level. How can you start addressing those gaps? And then how to plan the various milestones toward accreditation. As your host today to kind of walk you through everything is KAMIND CEO and best-selling author, Matt Katzer, with over 20 years in cybersecurity and the leader of the very first RPO here in our home state of Oregon. I can't think of a better person to help you understand the stairway ahead towards certification. So with all that out of the way, Matt, the show is yours.
Hey, thanks, Brennan. Thanks for the excellent introduction, and welcome everyone. And it's really interesting to see how CMMC has progressed through the past couple of years. And as we look at everything that's going on and the activities and what the basis of it, it's really kind of fascinating as we change. And what we're going to try to do today, what I have for you, is basically talking about, the pieces that we all need to be worried about is basically kind of the basic fundamental security infrastructure questions that we have. But the difference when you look at any type of accreditation, it's what is the gap. And by this, I mean where we are and where the standard wants us to be. And that's really the key. So, and I kind of looked through our business, and let me just give a quick introduction about KAMIND IT, for instance, for those who don't know. We're a cloud-first company. This is the third year that we're in the Inc. 5000, as fastest growing companies in the U.S. And we deploy cyber range tools as part of our training environment for our own security personnel. And also probably one of the big things that we are also a Microsoft AOSG or GCC high license supplier and a direct reseller and a managed partner. We're one of the less than 1% of the partners in the United States that have that. And we migrated tons of users 365, and I've personally written books. We have over 290,000 copies in print in terms of how to actually do things. So we have a lot of knowledge and everything else in terms of what's going on, and my own experience in terms of dealing with the Intel security teams and everything else. We look at a lot of things and we just build security fundamentally into our core offerings that we actually have at KAMIND. And it's really interesting when you look at CMMC, it's really the fundamental acceptance that cybersecurity is a core building block. Now, the question everybody asks is, well, this is just another government regulation. Why? And I was looking around what is the best way to actually show why this is happening and why it's important, not just for clients that are in the defense industrial base, but it's important for everyone. And it really comes down to this one slide that was taken at an air show. And the title of this thing on the article came out of USA Today was basically F-35s for everyone. China introduces a J-31 clone of the F-35. And how they actually got that clone is really interesting. Now, keep in mind, this is where we're doing the NIST 800-171 attestment, the saying that we met various cybersecurity standards from the primes and subs. But basically what's happened is a building contractor, an excavation contractor had the complete set of plans for the F-35, and basically they got breached and all that ended up in the Chinese hand and they built a clone. So when you look at what happens and the impact, and for us as taxpayers, you're talking about trillions of dollars of investments of things that are basically gone. And that affects us in terms of how we do business day to day in the corporate sector, in the defense industrial base from a security standpoint, granted, but this is the seriousness of what's going on. And we can no longer, all of us, as we are doing like from KAMIND, we managed services security partner as an MSP, managed services partner. We're all custodians for clients' data. And it doesn't matter what business that you're in or what type of activity that you have, is that you have a fundamental responsibility as a custodian for your client's data to protect it. And that's what this is all about. Now, as from a DoD standpoint, you have the CMC standard trying to drive it, but this is what we're really trying to get at. And this brings us to the real dilemma that we have today and why a lot of you are here, is about when you start looking at CMMC, it's really the data risk management. That's what we're trying to solve with it. And you're looking at the various pieces on it, and they go through and do the evaluation in terms of the organization that you have. You're trying to look in terms of what's the risk in terms of the organization. Have you actually kind of processed the data and dealt with the issues that you need to do? And then the other aspect, which is really super, super important, is you have to actually go through and you have to baseline the organization so you're at a certain level. And then with that is you go through a process of once you do a baseline, you do discovery. Now in CMC's timeframe, when we actually look at discovery, we're talking about trying to figure out where CUI information is, where's the scope of the environment. And then as we look through the pieces of it, we actually go through and say, okay, how do we actually manage it to make sure we're doing continuous improvement as we follow a different type of manufacturing models? And you all know when you look in terms of trying to build a product or manufacture a product, you're looking for constant compliance, looking for constant efficiency in the manufacturing. Compliance is no different when it takes and involves security. And then out of that, you get this recommendation, the next step. And this is where we find that we actually do the gap assessments. And that's what we actually talk about in this whole structure. Now, when you look at what CMMC is trying to solve and what they're trying to do, and you can actually talk about different perspectives on it, but really it's trying to do one fundamental. They're trying to put basically a holistic approach to security in terms of driven by the DoD. Now, there's been a lot of changes that's gone through with the new administrations that have been put in place. But the fundamental pieces are still there. There's going to be requires for standard security controls and processes. But also probably the biggest change that we actually seen is the executive order requiring all federal agencies to have a program like CMMC. So what is going to actually turn out? So to get a better idea of what the impact, and before we actually talk a little bit more about gap assessments, let's just go through this one fundamental slide that I took out of from a presentation that was made by the DoD announcing CMC last year. It's basically built this whole model. In the past, we would take and pin cybersecurity as a pillar in a building, as you've seen here. In this case, what's really fundamentally different, and what's fundamentally different the way we actually handle CMC today, it's this cybersecurity platform that's built on. And that's key because when you actually look in terms of what's happened, you have to go through and look at your processes and practices you have in the organization and say, do I have the fundamental cybersecurity structure in place? Now, and what this means is a lot of things. It may comes down to where is my systems being hosted? What am I putting on my servers? What type of network do I have? What type of network equipment do I have? Where's the network equipment source? All those issues come into place, and that's when you look at trying to look at a gap assessment from a CMC standpoint, you have to actually go back to the original processes and practices. As example, if you're doing like a level 1 or 2 type environment, clearly it's just looking at FCI. But once you get into the level 3, and for us, we're on like Office 365, you're actually required to be in a new version of Office 365 known as GCC. So you have some fundamental differences of how you can do things. And all that is basically built around a lot of things in terms of requirements of CMMC. Now, as DoD goes through and does a reevaluation of CMC, which is going through right now, and they're supposed to come out with a set of findings and changes, and there's been kind of comments on the various pieces. But the fundamental piece is when you actually go peel the onion of the CMMC, it's the implementation of a NIST 800-171's standard as in terms of what you need to do. Not like we had tests in the old days, and we could attest and generate a POAM, basically a plan to how we're going to actually get the missing pieces in place. It's actually going through a process where we actually have to implement it. And by the time contracts are awarded, we have to have accreditation. So with some definitions with that kind of a base, let's just give you some definitions, make sure we're all using the same thing. So some of the fundamental foundation of CMMC, federal contract information, which basically is not intended for public release, and it's contract information that you get from a contract officer. And, and that's basically, it's talking about that information is private. And you talk about controlled unclassified information, for instance. In control unclassified information, we're actually looking in terms of information that's classified on behalf, that's built on behalf of the government. Think of this as internal company IP that's basically unique. It's the same model in a lot of aspects. But what we have in terms of this is that it's very specified, and it's actually defined in the National Archives. What is CUI? Gives you a category list and associated with it. And when you actually look in terms of CUI, keep in mind that CUI can be information provided by the government. It could be information that your contract is generating through the process. So those are basically pieces that we have to put in place. Now, when you talk about GCC High, or I use the term AOSG, this is the version of Office 365 that's restricted for government or defense contractors. So not everyone has it, and this version of 365 is in a totally different data center. So you may have in some ways, we have clients that have a corporate 365 and they'll have GCC High. They are physically different facilities. They're not in the same facilities, and they're basically completely different and segregated environments. And it's done on purpose, basically, because they're trying to address situations. Let's put the necessary cyber controls in the environment so we can actually go and control the information so we don't have that a version of the J31 suddenly pop up. That's the type of thing that we're looking at. We're trying to figure out how to protect information. Now, some other terms that you'll have in terms of CMMC, you have registered practitioners. And these are people that basically have done the background check and have done certain assessments in cybersecurity maturity model certification specification. You have certified professors, certified assessors. They've been certified to perform an assessment for a C3PO. And as of so far, there's 3 C3POs that have been accredited. And you have registered provider organizations such as KAMIND, which specializes in implementation and assessments. And also you have the accreditation body, the CMC accreditation body, which basically manages the whole activities to make sure they're consistent. Now, one of the changes that happened last year, in November last year, was an interim rule. And that interim rule becomes more of a formal rule, and that's known as the DFARS Interim Clause 7020. And basically what this is requires that there's a supplier performance risk score against the NIST 800-171. So all contractors are required to actually rate and do a test to what their abilities are in terms against the NIST 800-171. And the other interesting thing on it is that this also clause requires that the primes look downstream to evaluate the subs in terms of how they're implementing things. So what 7020 clause does is actually put structure in place so that primes are now going after looking at all their subcontractors and saying, okay, sub A and sub B and sub C, how are your cyber hygiene for compliance against the NIST 800 171 CMC specifications? And so now you have this cyber requirements that's being reported. Now, there's a couple of different clauses. It's kind of interesting when you actually look at what's going on. And all of this plays in line in terms of trying to do the gap assessment. Because what's done in the 7020 and the interim clause and the DFAR clause is basically they said that there's three major tenets. One is that DoD has a right to assess and review your controls. So they have that ability to come in for a prime or sub at any time. That was one of the major changes. And also from a standpoint that if you're an organization that has an active contract, you're required to submit a SPUR score. And the score is going to rate you in terms of how you range from, at the low end, if you have absolutely bore, you're around the 203 to a perfect score of 110. And then you're going to have basically your scores get filed. Now, there's different strategies associated with it, but initially when you're talking to folks in terms of the industry that are trying to manage this, a lot of it is trying to get the baselines in place. So as DoD is looking for and also looking for other contractors and are looking for contract officers, they're looking for people that basically are showing a cyber maturity growth. And that's what you actually see. Now, what we're also seeing is that as primes are looking for new subs to do work, they're also trying to say, okay, what is your cybersecurity standard? What is your SPUR score? Because the prime cannot look in terms of the PI system to actually get the information. They have to request it from their sub. But as you get this information, you pull this information up, you're starting to get this whole ability of saying, okay, should a prime end up working with sub A that has a SPUR score of -200, or should the prime work at sub B that has a SPUR score of maybe 10? And so as there's a maturity of the organization, getting the set that pricing aside and cost structures and everything else, but there's clear competitive advantage that you're actually seeing with doing the SPUR score. And and that's what you're actually going to see. You're going to see this whole oversight model because of this that we're seeing already in the market in terms of what's happening in the 7020 clause. And and what's the real impact from from the user base and everything else? Well, it comes down to this: is that CMC in terms of the NIST 800 171/CMC program is basically you need to basically look in terms of what you're implementing to get on board. So when you actually start getting these compliance reviews by your prime, you don't get weeded out in the process. And that's kind of important to really think about with this gap analysis. And the whole purpose of a gap analysis is to figure out where you are against the current standard and what you actually need to do and how you actually implement the various technology pieces. So what is the DoD timeline that we're actually executing against? And this is key important. So as you go look through, and this is subject to change based on what's going to happen through the evaluations going on through the next couple months. But basically the end game on this is that the stake in the ground that has happened is that come October 2025, all new contracts that are going to awarded and bid on after that date are going to have a CMMC compliance. So that means that you're either going to have to get the CMC or what is CMC is going to morph into in terms of NIST 800 171. What you're going to see is you're going to have to do accreditation and you're going to have to get the pieces in place. And there's a lot of people trying to figure out this basis of it. And if you go back to the one slide originally, when you think of cybersecurity, cybersecurity is a fundamental building block. You have to build it into your organization. You have to change and put your methodology, and you have to basically put a security mindset, because that's the fundamental change that's happening in the way you approach everything. So when you look at the quick questions that we're always asked, and it's kind of interesting, it's like, the big issues that come up and say, what CUI do I have? Where do I have FCI? How do I protect all this information? Where does the information reside? And why do I need a SPUR scores? And if you got a prime requesting information, what do I actually tell them? And you have questions like this that you pop up that you get through. You really get it through a situation that you really need to figure out, okay, what you actually have and how do you actually scope your environment? And scoping is really critical because when you look in terms of like CMMC assessment, for instance, do you scope an entire organization of 1,000 people? And maybe out of that organization of 1,000 people, only 500 really have access to FCI, and only maybe 200 have access to CUI and FCI? Or do you break the organization down so you put it in basic segments? So you scope, so you may have in terms of a system assessment boundary, but you really look at in terms of what the assessment boundary is, it's really restricted down to various areas. So you have different levels of control structure. And that's what the whole thing when you talk about scope assessment and we talk about gap analysis. Because when you actually go through a process, one of the first things you do is you need to go and walk through the steps on it. You actually go through and figure out your SPUR score in terms of where you are. I mean, and SPUR score is really pretty straightforward. You can actually do it yourself. There's tools available, but it basically gives you the pieces that you can go through the process and figure out, okay, what have I actually, what have I done? What have I not done? That's basically what you're doing with the SPUR score. And when you do a scope assessment, you're basically saying, what CUI do I have? What FCI? How do I protect it? Where does it reside? Do I have data flow diagrams for it? And those are the questions that you actually ask. Now, one of the big things that we get from clients when we talk to them about CUI, it's a very simple one. And the best way to do is go to National Archive site and go take a look at what CUI is. And this is all the major categories of CUI, the resources and everything else. I put the link on there so you should be able to actually easily see it. And there's also CUI training so you can actually tell the pieces of it. And so from a gap assessment, when you start, you want to try to get the basic information so you know how to make the different decisions that you need to make. And that's kind of really key. So the question you have, you get all this stuff together, how do you get started? Well, basically looking from CMMC, you got to understand what the levels are in terms of, and it really comes down to which parts of the organization is going to have just FCI, which parts of the organization has CUI. Now, from a fundamental security standpoint, when we actually implement security clients, we actually implement security clients according to like a level 1 CMMC, because this is fundamental in terms of organization cybersecurity. I mean, it's things like, okay, are you guys running an MFA, for instance? Do you have access in terms of, do you have controlled access to who comes into the office? Do you basically log visitors? Do you audit the logs? I mean, everyone should raise their hand and say, if I ask a question, does everyone audit their logs on a weekly, monthly, daily, or basis, or is there some process associated with it? Do you have incident reporting methodology? There's just some fundamental things that you need to do to make sure that you can take care of the health of the organization. And that's really what the levels are about. Now, in terms of what happens with CMMC as compared to NIST 800-171, they basically went to a model saying, okay, let's go define domains, and we have 17 common domains that are being used in terms of access controls and asset management. And this will make more sense in a bit because there's another tool that we have, since this is predominantly Microsoft, using the Microsoft 365 Placemat, which actually shows a mapping of these domains and processes to the subscription types that are used. Now, there's another key aspect when you actually talk about domains, and that's in this domain model, which basically breaking in saying that, okay, when you actually look at a domain, you have processes and you have practices. And those are actually key because one is basically talking about how things are being done in an organization, and the other part is actually talking about the capabilities of the organization. So as you go through like level 1, for instance, there's not really a formal model in terms of you don't have to have a lot of things written down, but in reality, you should. And that's kind of the key things when you start doing gap assessments. Now, how this all maps into the CMMC model and the domains is really simple. The domains are basically enabled for different categories. Now, what we actually do from a KAMIND standpoint, and this is something that I strongly recommend to everyone to do, is you need to basically align yourself with a tool manufacturer or some type of capability to basically determine your gap assessment. I mean, the tools that we standardize and use for, in case of future feed, for instance, that we use, And we basically are a partner with them. And what we actually do is we have the ability to map out the various domain structures. So when you actually look at these cases, you can go expand into the different areas associated with it and see in terms of what your score. Now, this is like a level 1 type of domain status. Now, you can actually easily take this, map this into a level 3 or a NIST 800-171 medium or a NIST 800-171 high. All the data cross maps each other. But when we use the tools, the way to look at tools, especially a tool like the one that we use, is that it becomes a single point of truth. So when you actually do a say, we have master documents associated, we put pieces, but you have multiple pieces working on it, and you also have clients working on it. So you have a much more partnership model, and that's how things are actually completed, so that we as a partnership with our clients, we actually get the pieces together. And as you look in terms of evaluating your own needs, you have to go down this route to say that, okay, I'm going to use some type of tool, go pick which one you like. We have one that we use, and you're going to have to determine, okay, let's get our score in place to figure out where we are, and then let's go figure out how to implement the gap assessment. And that's critical to how this is done. And when you look at this, is that data is always owned by the client, and from our perspective, and we always operate in a custodian model. So that's basically to make sure that we get the pieces in place and we actually have a level playing field to move ahead. Now, one of the first things you do in the gap assessment is really get a hold of this Microsoft 360, the Microsoft CMMC Placemat implementation. Now, what this is on the right-hand side is that you actually see capability of, you can actually go look at the different subscription type. In this case is E5. Now, when I actually select an E5 and I have different capabilities, it goes through the various CMC domains and tells me which one's been implemented, so which is a primary service and which is a secondary service. So from a technical implementation, you get all the technical pieces associated with that, and that's really key. And then you can actually map it. So actually, when you start looking at your subscription models, either in 365 corporate or 365 AOSG or GCC high, you see the pieces. And as you go look in terms of another perspective on this is what we actually looking, you can actually see what the placemat model looks at. So when you look at security suites in terms of what you're using for firewalls, are you using Azure MFA with conditional access? You're doing identity government. All those, are you doing PIM, which you all should be using PIM if you're in 365 model. And all these things are necessary to actually get us to level. And that's how you see the different domains. So when you actually do different options, and this is how you can actually figure out the first steps to getting your gap assessment. Where are you with these pieces? What work do you need to do? And then you use tools to actually, the compliance management tools, record it. Now, Microsoft also has, in terms of compliance management tools to help us in this gap, is we actually go through and look at terms of actually handle in terms of Azure. So we can actually map the maturity model to it, so we see the pieces. Now, if you look at what this looks like, and I think there's a question there. Yes.
Yeah, Matt, sorry to cut you off. So there was a really good question from the audience that I wanted to address because it specifically dealt with licensing. And so some of you may not understand the AOSG licensing, but it does come at a little bit of a heftier price tag than probably you're used to spending. And the question was, as of this moment, do you know if there's any alternatives to something like an AOSG license, because the cost is higher than your average Microsoft, E5 license per se? Do we know of any alternatives if that cost seems to be, I'm going to use a strong word here, prohibitive, I guess?
Now, right now, well, there's the Microsoft strategy on the licensing for the corporate tenant and AOSG. They want to have a parity strategy across the board. And there's long-term strategies to drive the cost down. It's just more costly to do AOSG. Now, what you can actually do, like in the Microsoft 365 E5, and why this is probably the popular license right now, because Microsoft actually has, they do federal systems work. They're going through compliance management themselves right now, and they're using the 365 E5. So what you're trading off in terms of using lesser subscriptions or different mixes is you're not riding on the Microsoft coattails. So you're going to trade off in terms of the license cost versus the implementation cost. And when you actually would look at what's going on, especially with in terms of, looking at different types of cross compatibility, or you looking at terms of, if you already done a certain level of certification, then you're grandfathered into something, which is still being discussed what happens. If you're on the Microsoft stack, what you actually are getting when you do the ASG E5, you are picking up their work to go through compliance through the CMMC process. That's key. Now, if you want to look at in terms of, let's say you want to match pieces together, so you want to have a third-party supplier here, but you're going to keep email in 365 OSG. Yeah, you can get a lesser subscription like Exchange Plan 1. You can do lesser subscriptions like an Office E3. There's a AOSG high, but you have to wrap all those other pieces around it. And that's where you actually look at the cost structure, because cost is actually it comes down to what we call the total cost of ownership. So kind of a long answers, but yeah, you can actually piecemeal things together, and there's third-party services say they can do different pieces in terms of AWS. From our standpoint, we really just focus on the Microsoft stack.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. Now I know where we are now, so continue showing the Azure piece. Thank you.
Okay, so getting back to the things, so what you're actually seeing here in terms of the Azure, this is lighting up like an Azure 365 E5 subscription. And that's just one of the pieces that you have. And that gets back to the earlier question that Brandon was asked, is that how do you have to really look in terms of compliance from a standpoint of total cost of ownership. You're going to pay X number of dollars to do a certain function. The question is, where's the best place to spend those dollars? And that's where you trade off in terms of, like, identity management, for instance. You may choose to use Okta versus the Office 365 identity management solution. There's pros and cons associated with that. We're clearly on the 365 version, so I hope that people understand that. It's just different, but that's a cost trade-off that you need to make. And where you find those cost trade-offs is really from this flow chart. There's really 5 steps that you need to follow in terms of how you actually, and I could use this for CMC level 3, but this could be CMC level 1 for all it matters, or just doing in terms of trying to meet NIST 800 score assessment and kind of deployment. The key thing that you're trying to actually do is, when you do these things, is you really want to get to a point that you basically, the first step you have to do is you're going to have to go through a SPRS assessment. Now, for contract holders, this is required. Under the interim DFAR clause 7020, you have to do this. Now, what we actually find for a lot of organizations, even those organizations in the corporate side, going through a SPRS assessment is going through a NIST 800 score assessment is really critical, because that really helps to figure out where the baseline is. And then the other aspect, the next piece of it, and you can look at this from, intellectual property information being shared in organizations. That's an easy way to look at it, is a scope assessment. From a defense industrial base, we're looking at FCI and CUI, where that information is located. And we're trying to find it with the sole purpose of how to actually reduce the assessment scope. And the way you reduce costs is you basically go through and you limit scope. Now you look in terms of organization that are dealing with HIP information or financial information. Very same process we go through. It's going through and trying to identify, scope the environments out. And then once you actually scope the area, the piece you have to go through is a scope assessment. And literally what that is going through each of the controls, like when you actually look at a CMC control, like an AC1, for instance, you go through an AC1.001 and say, did I actually meet this? Did I not meet this? What are the pieces I need to do? And those are actually kind of the key that those things that you want to actually see. Then once you actually get through that scope assessment, the next step is you go through basically you implement the controls for the scoped area. Now, implementing controls in CMMC means that you have both practices and processes associated that maps to the technical implementation. The technical implementations that we use, we follow the Microsoft Placemat. And the reason why we follow the Placemat and the reason why we follow the Microsoft 365 is a very simple one. we're trying to reduce the total cost of ownership for ourselves and also for the clients that we manage, and that's key. And then at the final step in the process, you have to actually go deploy and manage the activity. So CMMC is not like set it and forget it. The example I showed you about the F-35 and the J-35, that's what happens when you set it and forget it, where you test something but not fully implement it. You don't execute against a POAM. You have to, in this case of what we're trying to solve, is you're trying to address the thing so you change the fundamental maturity of the organization. From a flow, this looks similar to this, that you're actually going to follow through. You know, do your scoring on the controls, do your scope and a gap assessment, and then you go implement. And the piece that you basically, that CMC really does the change and really implements it, that you're going to see that is not going to go away, is this whole continuous management process. So you have to go through this process where you're going to have accreditation of some type. You're going to have to actively manage and change it because things change over time. And you're going to have to get ready to do an accreditation 3 years later. So if you do your homework right, what's going to happen is that you will have the necessary processes put in place so you're ready to go for accreditation when it comes up for renewal. So it's not a major lift and shift like it is right now. And that's how you actually accomplish this whole thing when you gap assessment. And the way you record information is you have to manage in some kind of a compliance management tool. And here's an example one where basically we're doing NIST 800, 171, trying to get a SPUR score, but basically it's and compare it to how it does a CMC level 3. So you get an idea in terms of the amount of work and effort that's being done. But you actually go through, as you build in all this information, it is a living document. It's a living process that you actually do over time, and that's really super key. And so that's kind of as you look at it. And so a lot of questions is that, you know, how can we help you and what is the approach that do? Well, it comes down to really this. We talked about this overall. What you're really, our approach and handle this, it's very planned, it's a very progressive, and it designs to support continuous process improvement. And that's the way our security models are built. And this is maps in time to the natural flow of the way CMC built. That's why we're so much in favor in terms of driving this type of standards in place, because we're trying to prevent that problem. And it's not just trying to dealing like the defense industrial that's industrial base. It is all of us. You know, as you look through situations of that you're banking with banks, you're looking for situations that you're transacting or have business with a not-for-profit. You want to make sure that as you basically things are taken care of, as you basically build this stuff, as you basically help and support your community, you want to make sure stuff is being protected and stuff is that we're not wasting money in terms of activities. So someone can actually take it and duplicate it and steal the information and sell it, because we're trying to protect those things. And that's really important. And the only way you can actually achieve this is with a pick a standard and do a continuous process, an evolutionary process model to make sure you're constantly addressing. So what information can you actually have to actually help you through the process? Well, there's a good link here. This is on Microsoft has a new web page out. This is on the CMMC information on their federal web page. And there's two information. We're part of the team that was able to give early input to the technical reference guide for CMMC. There now is a 352-page guide that will actually go out, and you can actually go through and you can actually look in terms of understand what your cloud journey is going to be with CMMC. But more importantly, as part of this, it's mapped to this journey as you look through this, as you look the journey through the CMMC Placemat. And that's really the key thing, is that you're looking at standards you want to do. And the earlier question was trying to look at what cost, because it's a heavy lift. The issues associated with the total cost of ownership. So if you actually have lesser solutions and like the AOSG solution, for instance, and you decide to actually scratch build together, go look at the amount of time it takes to scratch build it. Go look at the amount of effort that you actually put in. Look at the third-party tools you need to put together. And that's what drives the whole pieces, and you'll spend much more money than associated with the AOSG license. And that's kind of the piece that you have to think about. Now we have some other things going, so that gives you an idea. We're going to open up for questions in a few minutes. And one of the things that we're doing, we're putting on an event. This is on mark your calendars on the 28th, and we'll be sending notices out. We'll have multiple speakers on it. We're talking from different parts of the organizations, companies in terms of what Microsoft has in their security model, in terms of what's going on, in terms of the market, in terms of some of the changes they have. So we'll have a variety of different speakers. And this is really trying to give you an idea of what you need to do and how you actually will, what the types of things that you need to think about and how you actually look at the pieces you need to go through and get things in place. And with that is that the question is, how do you actually get started? Well, it's very simple, and we'll open the questions in a second, is that, it's a process. And we have this diagram over here, the stair-step model is what you're actually following. So if you're looking at where you want to try to achieve, you have to go through a couple different steps. And you can do these yourself. You're still going to go through the process. And there's a lot of information available in terms of Microsoft Technical Reference Guide, in terms of what's been published by the DoD itself, in terms of how you actually do self-assessments on the pieces. So the information's there. You just have to get started. That's probably the biggest thing to do. And if you're going after AOSG licenses, or you want to be in CMC level 3 and higher, you're going to actually you're going to have to actually use GCC high licenses. But at the same time, you may actually make a decision to deploy those enclave licenses in like an Azure virtual desktop environment, which you can actually meet the requirements in terms of ML3. So if you have more information and questions about that, just go book a 15-minute call with a registered practitioner and fill out the form for that at kamind.com/feedback. With that, whatever questions we have.
Excellent, Matt, and thank you so much for the presentation. A couple slides back, there was a Microsoft link about some CMMC. I wanted to make sure I threw that in the chat. So if you didn't get a chance to highlight and copy it, I wanted to put it in there for you. Thank you also for putting up the feedback link. In a couple of minutes, I'll make sure that's up there. I don't want to overwhelm the chat with those. But now that we are here, if you have any questions, feel free to unmute your mic and ask away. Or if you'd like to, you can also pop a question in the chat, whatever is easiest for you. But feel free to ask away, friends. Thank you. Ooh, Matt, it looks like I got a question coming here from the chat to myself, and then it looks like we got a handful of people typing them in. But someone is asking about NDIA, or the National Defense Industrial Association, released a white paper urging the Pentagon to provide more clarity on requirements concerning, compliant cloud environments. Do you have any? I guess I would say, is there any insight you can offer as a cloud company, KAMIND? How we think that's going to look, and maybe provide a little clarity for the team. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, I mean, that's really good questions, and we've been talking with some other practitioners in the market, and what people involved and people have the need to know. Some of the questions are like, do you really need a level 2 and level 4 for CMMC, for instance? And how much do you actually need to, when you actually look at some of the accreditation requirements? Can you pass through, what can you actually pass through in terms of your contract, and what's going to be subsidized and what's not? And they're looking at a lot of it from like some of the requirements for level 1, how to actually loosen some of these things up. But everything comes back to one thing, is everything is looking at NIST 800 171, is going to be the baseline. They're expecting a level of cybersecurity. And what's really complicated this whole thing is that you're also seeing like DHS is now basically having their version that looks very similar to the CMMC. And then you also have, in terms of GSA, putting the requirements in place. And, you know, one of the things that really think back is they're also talking about, does something like the, you know, how do you actually handle the accreditation process so you only have one entity that does accreditation across the entire federal space? So the neat pieces to us is that, you know, NIST 800-171 is not going to go away. And if you basically don't believe in terms of CMMC or the process, then you're going to have to actually believe in terms of NIST 800-171. And the real question on the matter, the real question that's on the table is, will they allow POAMs for after you know, October of 2025? Now, keep in mind, that's what the model they had in place when the F-35 information was stolen. So we'll see what happens. And it's, you know, we'll find out in probably the next couple of months.
Excellent. Thank you for that question. Matt, another one, and I thought this one was very close. And as I recall, you have some quote unquote inside information on this one. But a participant asked, do we have any timetable for GCC High to be available on a monthly subscription, much like many of our customers currently, and I'm sure people on here are used to paying? Do we know what that timetable looks like?
Rumor has it, you know, probably the end of 23, second half of 23. I think you're not going to see it this year. You're not going to see it in 21, 22. I doubt you're going to see it in the second half of 22. My understanding, there's technical issues on making that happen. And there's a tied into, there's a couple of different initiatives that Microsoft has tied into how they handle delegated administrative processes and things like that in the partner tenants. So a lot of that stuff is being put in place. And also keep in mind, how do you actually control who has it and from what country of origin that you can actually access various things? So there's that part too.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was something that we have been monitoring as closely as we can. So I'm glad that question was brought up. Another really good question, and I think it's a little bit outside of our purview, but Matt, you might have a better understanding. Is there a cost estimate for getting to the accreditation phase of CMMC?
Well, I mean, that's a hard one. It really depends what that really, you know, getting into accreditation from a cost structure really depends on a couple of things. That look at the organization and what's the maturity of the organization. And if you look at in terms of what the estimate costs that going through the NDI forums and others, and even through our own calculations, you're talking about, you know, for organizations around 30 to 40 people, easily can look at if they're basically are totally out in the weeds in terms of cybersecurity model and you know, processes and practices. Yeah, it's going to be, you can spend upwards of probably, you know, 80, 100,000 in the process. And that's kind of what they're talking about. If you're an organization that basically started to adapt and putting the cyber processes in place, then you're going to see lower accreditation costs. And if you're an organization that basically saying that, you know, remember the old, in terms of the World War II stuff they have, you know, loose lips sink ships. It's about who needs to know information. Do you have the necessary, have you put the necessary information controls? Have you basically trying to restrict access in the organization? Those are things that need to be put in place, and those drive down assessment cost. And that's, so it's, you're asking a hard question. The way we look at it is we really do two things. You know, scoring and scope assessments are fairly straightforward activities. Gap assessments really come out of, really are a byproduct of, you know, what is the scope of the environment and how well did an organization do on their NIST 800-171 scoring? And that drives the price.
Excellent. Thank you, Matt. I'm going to post in the chat right now quickly. Ooh, I gotta get out of here. In there now is the feedback form. We'd certainly love the opportunity to hear from you outside of the questions that you've been asking. Also, we still have 10 more, we now have 8 minutes left. We will certainly want to be respectful of everybody's time. But if you do have any feedback for us, we'd certainly love it. I'm also going to remind you that there will be another CMMC, not necessarily a webinar, but really more of a full-fledged event or symposium. We're still toying with the name. And if you love hearing my voice and Matt's voice just a little bit less, then we'll actually have some presenters that will be joining us. You won't have to just hear the two of us. So keep your eyes open for your emails, watch your mailbox, as we will be sending you all invitations for that special event. But we still have, like I said, we still have 8 more minutes. So if you do have any follow-up questions, please feel free. The chat is live, and go ahead and unmute your microphone, unless, of course, you have the leaf blower going.
Yeah, the one thing I would encourage everyone to do, and this is probably the one comment that we have when we talk to all the other folks in the different forums and everything else, is that you basically have to start the process. And the more you delay in starting the process, the greater risk that you have. Because when you actually get right down to it, even if you go through CMC does a certain morph in terms of what's the requirements of some of the pieces, it's not going away. So no one should think that it is going away. This is pretty much, they're trying to solve some fundamental problems, and the current model that was implemented doesn't work. So we look through the pieces, cybersecurity, it's core, it's fundamental to what we do. We have to put it into everything, and we have to change our process model to make sure it makes sense. And it's a cultural change for us as well.
Any more questions? If not, we will, Matt, this will be a very rare thing for you. You're going to get a whole 5 minutes back in your day, which is something that you don't often get. But if there are no more questions, for the greater good here, there is the feedback form. Feel free to put anything that you want in that feedback form. If it requires some follow-up, either from myself, Mike Clash, or Matt, we're happy to do that. Maybe it's something from our technical team or our director of security. We can certainly forward that on. But most importantly, we really want to thank everyone for attending today. We hope you found the information both relevant and valuable for what you're facing ahead. Matt, thank you so much for the presentation. Again, I put the feedback link in the chat, and then also kind of a little friendly reminder for when our next event surrounding CMMC will be. That date is associated with October 28th. But if you don't have any more questions, everybody enjoy those extra 5 minutes. Thank you so much for attending today, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. So thank you, everybody.